And good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being with us today, no matter where you're watching from. We warmly welcome you. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the leadership team at America at a Crossroads. That team consists of former Congressman Mel Levine, former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, and me. Welcome back, and thanks to tonight's guest, David Frum. I was just watching you on CNN a minute ago. Thank you for being here with us right after that. And welcome and thank you to our moderator, Patt Morrison. Tonight's discussion, America's democracy. Where do we go from here? So much to talk about. Between tonight and our next program, which is next Thursday, we'll begin the Jewish high holiday season, starting with Rosh Hashanah, which begins on Monday evening. From our team, we offer these thoughts in honor of the Jewish New Year and best wishes to our audience who observe. In a time when justice feels fragile, truth is contested, and compassion is under siege, let us not lose our resolve to imagine something better. A world where human dignity is not debated but defended, a world where we answer fear not with silence but with solidarity, a world where our values of equity, freedom, and justice are more than ideals but are commitments. On the high holidays, Jews the world over will communally affirm that through our faith, our service, and our actions, we can soften or transform the harshness of our fate. The words in Hebrew are uteshuva, utfila, utzdaka, ma'avirin et ro'ah hagazerah. Teshuva literally means return, a concept which provides the framework for personal accountability and communal transformation. Tefillah literally means prayer, but also means service or dedication of the heart. And tzedakah, of course, means the pursuit of justice, which we often translate to charity. Our hope for all of us is that this year we stay grounded in hope and embrace the power that we each have to change the world. May the year ahead be sweet. It can be sweet without being easy. It won't be easy. A year that we can face together with resolve, a year in which we together can make a difference. Shana Tova to all of our guests who observe the Jewish holidays. Next week on Thursday, I know you've all been following the crises on college campuses. The most recent attack has been at the nation's largest public university system, the University of California. So far at UCLA alone, which is only one of 13 UC campuses, upwards of $550 million in research grants have been frozen, and the total impact of these and other threatened cuts could amount to more than $1 billion. The impact mostly in the arena of medical research. Next week, the brand new Chancellor of UCLA, Julio Frank, will be in conversation with Larry Mantle. Can America's universities survive the current assault? And then the following week, UC Berkeley, UCLA Center for Israel Studies, and the Diller Institute at Berkeley will join together with us for a program that's going to be from 10 to 11:30 in the morning on September 30th, 30 years since Oslo. Why did the Accords fail? And can the Israeli-Palestinian peace process be salvaged? There could be no more timely topic than that. We'll be joined by former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and the former Foreign Minister of the PA, Nasser Al-Kidwa. You can register for all of these programs in the email you'll get after tonight's program. Now, without further ado, please welcome tonight's moderator, Patt Morrison. She's extraordinary in every way. She's an LA Times columnist and a long-time and multiple award-winning broadcast journalist on TV and radio, a literal icon in Southern California and beyond. The great Patt Morrison. Patt, the show is yours.
Janice, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who watches and supports this program. So much more vital. A time we cannot imagine for discussion like this, for enlightenment like this to be shared. And we welcome, of course, David Frum joining us, a political commentator, former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, and a senior editor at The Atlantic, as well as you just heard, someone who appears frequently on CNN and a contributor to MSNBC. Thank you for shifting gears and moving over to our program so adroitly this evening.
Thank you. I do want to say I'm not an MSNBC contributor and never have been. This is an example
don't know
of
why
what
that's in the bio.
It's in Wikipedia, but don't trust Wikipedia. But I do have I never have been, but I hope viewers will turn into the podcast we started on April 9th for The Atlantic. And we have a show tonight about infectious disease. And my God, there's a lot of infectious disease about us.
And that was certainly a subject on Capitol Hill, which I hope we'll get to a little later. And we also want to get to your questions. If you will put them in the Q&A box, we may be addressing them during the course of my conversation with David Frum, but some questions will arise in your minds that we hope to be able to address later in the program. So there, everything is the deep end of the pool right
Yeah.
now. And the latest news comes with the decision by ABC to indefinitely suspend Jimmy Kimmel's program. Donald Trump has called, and White House Post has called Kimmel a sick freak. This comes on the heels of the Colbert Show being canceled as well. Discussions, I gather, by the FCC commissioner with the affiliates of ABC, like Sinclair, who carried the Kimmel Show. And essentially, it's like, no more Kimmel. So the question is, the pressure of the free speech matter conducted by the White House on these outlets versus the outlets themselves going along with the idea that, okay, we'll placate the White House and cancel these shows.
The shows are canceled, and that will lead some people to use the phrase cancel culture, which is a phrase that circulated from about 2014 to 2022. And if people take away from this broadcast or this discussion tonight one idea, I want it to be this: do not use the phrase cancel culture, because this is not about culture. Cancel culture was about informal social sanctions that where people who were prevented or punished or for saying something they had a legal right to say. The government didn't get in the way, but their university, their art gallery, whatever it was, they took a non-legal action. That is not what happened to Kimmel. It is not what happened. Kimmel was given a script to read by the government. And the government said to ABC, if you, these are the things that may be said about the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and these are the things that may not be said. And if you fail to say the things that must be said and say any of the things that may not be said, there will be state government retaliation against the parent corporation. This is not cancel culture. It is state repression. It is an act by the government, a threat from the government, a threat from the regulator of ABC. This is what will happen to you if your broadcasters do not say what we want them to say. It is about as serious as an attack on free speech can be. Nothing like this happened during the McCarthy era. The government did not, in the McCarthy era, say, here's what you must say on pain of punishment. Nothing like this. I mean, I'm sure there's a moment in American history you can compare it to, but it is unfathomable to me. The Trump administration said, you must say the following things. You may not say the following things. And there is direct threat of government retaliation against ABC and Disney if they host broadcasters who don't say what must be said and say what may not be said.
What did they want Kimmel to say, and what did the government not want Kimmel to say?
I don't know exactly what the trigger was, but I think what the government wants is a level of sadness. There must be a kind of level of funereal sadness, and what you may not say is anything that questions. The government wants to suggest that there is some kind that the killer of let's not make any bones, it's a terrible crime that has left a family fatherless, husbandless, that has affected the hearts of millions of people who admired Charlie Kirk. And whether you admired Charlie Kirk or not yourself, you can well imagine there are people you do admire. How would you feel if one of them had been struck down in this horrific way, with all the consequences of their family? But the government says we want you to be sad, appropriately sad, and we want you not to suggest there's any doubt about our story that there's a conspiracy here. The government's claim is that this assassination is connected to other things, because we don't have to speculate about this. President Trump said this on national television. His top aide, Stephen Miller, said it. We intend to use this killing as our opportunity to shut down Democratic Party fundraising in advance of the 2026 elections. President Trump tried that in April of this year when he ordered the Justice Department to investigate Act Blue, the Democratic small dollar platform. And now he is saying, again, we are going after their fundraising networks. And the they is obviously not, there's no conspiracy as far as anybody can show about the killing of Charlie Kirk. There's no other killers. There are no associates, no accomplices, no accessories. There's just this one miserable person. But what they're after is, as Trump has said, I want to shut down George Soros. I want to shut down ABC. I want to shut down Jimmy Kimmel. I want to stop my opponents from raising money for peaceful and legal opposition to me. That's what's at stake this week.
Why does ABC not stand up to this? Because it seems like a slam dunk case as far as the First Amendment is concerned.
Because ABC is owned by Disney, and Disney is subject to other pressures. And from Disney's point of view, the ABC broadcast entertainment division is a very small dollar aspect. We've seen this happen with a couple of these other networks. So Trump began by bringing an action against ABC, Disney, for something George Stephanopoulos said. And George Stephanopoulos was slightly off base that on air he referred to Trump raping a woman, when in fact all that the courts found was that Trump was civilly liable for a civil sexual assault on the woman. And if you find it a meaningful difference to have a civil liability for civil sexual assault versus criminal rape, that will mean a lot to you. If not, not. But Stephanopoulos blurred the distinction, and Trump demanded $15 million fine paid to him personally, which Disney, for other reasons, agreed to give. The next action was against CBS. So there's a small color, tiny little grain of sand of truth to what Trump said against ABC. Against CBS, it was garbage from beginning to end. Against CBS, the complaint was that CBS had edited the Kamala Harris interview that they did before the election on 60 Minutes in a way that Trump didn't like. Now, there is massive, massive First Amendment doctrine and FCC practice that says editing is a First Amendment protected function. And anyway, if anybody has a complaint about the editing, it's the person who has edited, Kamala Harris herself. If she doesn't complain, no one else is standing to bring any complaint. It's nonsense. It's garbage. It would not last seconds. But CBS, which is part of a larger corporate entity, which was seeking government approval for a deal, they also agreed to pay Trump. He sued the New York Times, a rather more robust institution. He sued the Wall Street Journal, which has also been impressively robust. Now he's after ABC because he doesn't like Jimmy Kimmel, but more that there's this atmosphere of pressure because the goal here is to attack Democratic Party fundraising in advance of 2026.
Just today, he threatened Jonathan Karl of ABC News, who asked about Pam Bondi's threat to go after anybody who was practicing hate speech. And President Trump said I'll probably go after him over the alleged hate against the Trump administration. Insulted reporter Karl. He said, we'll probably go after people like you because you treat me so unfairly. It's hate. You have a lot of hate in your heart.
Yeah. Well, if you read this crazy legal filing that Trump made against the New York Times, which looks like it was substantially dictated by Trump himself and not written by a lawyer, his complaint against the New York Times is they don't pay enough tribute to his success. That they have said negative things about him. These are not legal matters, but understand that this is about the government of the United States has scripts that it wants people in the news media to read. And it wants penalties if you don't read the script that is put in front of your nose. As I say, this could not be more alarming, but the ultimate goal is it's not just about interfering with broadcast media because of Trump's vanity and other compulsions. They're playing for serious stakes. Stephen Miller is not an ego-driven person. J.D. Vance is not a psychological head case. They are after something much more substantial, which is shutting down political competition before a midterm election that they fear, right, with great justice, they are in danger of losing. And if they do lose control of Congress, then what happens to all of Trump's business interests? What happens to the billions of dollars he's receiving from businesses and foreign governments?
Or the Epstein case, for that matter.
What happens to the Epstein case? What happens to so many things? They cannot risk losing control of Congress, and they will lose Congress if the competition is free and fair.
So if not ABC, if not CBS, who is going to carry the ball to the Supreme Court to challenge not only their own individual cases, but the ripple effect of all of them?
Yeah. Can I say, when you talk about the Supreme Court, we're speaking a little bit about the before times, that I think it's difficult for all of us to understand what a new world we live in. The Supreme Court is not necessarily going to be a resource here. When Donald Trump was in criminal jeopardy for his attempt to overthrow the 2020 election, those cases went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court fabricated out of nothing a new doctrine of presidential criminal immunity. The conservatives on the Supreme Court have believed two things. One is that the law must be interpreted in the light of plain light of constitutional text. And if there's any uncertainty about the plain constitutional text, then you have to look back at the original intent of the writers of the Constitution. Those are our two sources of meaning: plain text, original intent. Now, if you look at those two sources, you will see nothing about presidential criminal immunity, and what little you see suggests the president is criminally liable. But this Supreme Court, with a 6-3 conservative majority, said we are going to disregard our own stated principles to fabricate out of thin air a complicated and vague doctrine of presidential immunity that is written just to protect Donald Trump. It won't protect other presidents because it's so vague and we don't know about the application. It's written to protect Trump from these particular cases. So the idea that we're going to go to the Supreme Court and get justice, I'd be careful about that. The question is what we're all going to do as individuals in a situation where the state is turning repressive and where the courts are not always to be relied on. It's a more dark moment than that. And so the question
What
all of
about
us is, are we going to be intimidated out of speaking? Because in the end, the repressive apparatus of the United States will break down if they have to repress enough people.
what is the individual possibility of action? Because I think people are starting to look over their shoulders and starting to curb their opinions and who they express them to simply because of what they're seeing at such exalted levels.
We're doing it right now. Just speak. Just speak. Speak in as many places as you can, in as many ways as you can. Live without fear. Because the project is to create a feeling of what cannot be said, and fight back on what I think is their ultimate target, which is the fundraising for their political opposition. They really want to shut. That's the Orban method. That's the method of other repressive governments. If they can turn off the flow of resources to their political opponents, then even if people do speak, the speech won't matter very much.
And this is where we get back to the idea of action being taken by the Trump administration, contemplated at least against Act Blue,
Yeah.
against perhaps nonprofits like the ACLU.
Yeah. They're going to have a lot of these. And this is, as I said, the actions against Act Blue date back to April. The president personally directed the Justice Department to investigate them. More is coming. More is coming against George Soros. The president said he wants to put George Soros in prison if he can. Now, a lot of this talk, of course, with Trump is bluster, and he says a lot of things, but it's worth listening to him and to understand, even if he can't do everything he wants to do, it's important to know what the president of the United States wants to do.
So when we hear perhaps a Pam Bondi or a Stephen Miller talk about hate speech and
Yeah,
say that it is illegal when in fact it is not, except
yeah.
under very limited circumstances, are they planting the notion that what they are doing is okay? That
No, what they're doing is
limiting what people are saying is okay?
they're revealing their intentions. That whether or not they ultimately succeed, that's a question mark. But what Stephen Miller and Pam Bondi are saying is we don't think it should be legal to criticize us. Our definition of hate speech, as President Trump says, speech that criticizes me.
The speech
Um,
we hate.
yeah, speech that, as he said in the New York Times, speech that says I was not as successful in business as I claim to be. That's hate speech, and I want to stop it if I can. Now, some of his projects will succeed, others will fail. But he's telling you where he intends to go. That's the reason to listen to Donald Trump, not what he will do, because he often is unable to do the things he says he will do. But what does he want to do? He is the president. It matters what he wants to do, even if some initiatives fail, because other initiatives will succeed.
We have seen in Congress in the last few weeks sometimes cracks in the pro-Trump facade, the support
Yeah,
facade. Certainly when it comes to the Epstein documents, we've
yeah,
seen Republicans stand up and say, we want more. And just the hearings about RFK Jr. and the CDC in
yeah.
the last day or so have been troubling to Republicans as well. Is there any critical mass in Congress that is looking at these First Amendment threats and saying, maybe we ought to say something about this too?
Um, I think that the fact that is most moving Republicans is the consequences of the Trump economic policy. Um, Trump, in his first administration, in the first 3 years, was not that successful in implementing his crazy economic ideas about disrupting trade patterns. He did do some tariffs in 2018, and they had negative consequences. The stock market was affected, but mostly he was not able to muck up the economy too much in the first 3 years of his first administration. Then came the calamity of COVID, which Trump made so much worse. But this second administration, he's begun from the beginning, waging war on global commerce, imposing heavy taxes on Americans. To give you an idea of how onerous these Trump tariffs are, have you heard of this concept, no tax on tips?
Yes.
Okay, you've heard a lot about it. It's basically a malarkey. I mean, it's a scam because it only applies to some tips and it expires in 2028. But the total cost to the Treasury of that gimmick is over the period from the time that the bill goes into effect till the end of 2028, so that's 3+ years, um, uh, $30 billion. That is how $30 billion is how much money the Trump tariffs extracted from everyday Americans just in the month of August.
Hmm.
So what he says he's giving to everyday Americans in his no tax on KIPP, he in 1 month over that's 3.5 years. In 1 month, he's taken that back in the tariff cost of August, and the tariffs will extract even more in September than they do in August. So he's imposed this onerous tax on Americans. It's dragging down the economy. It's driving up prices, and it's also pushing down his poll numbers. And that is the thing that will loosen his grip on members of Congress, as they'll say, that could be the seat you're putting at risk could be mine. And these tariffs, which members of Congress do not love, are vote losers. And as that bites, I think you will see. Oh, and by the way, we did not sign up to bring measles back. The idea that this is going to be a major initiative of the Trump, more measles, more diphtheria, more cholera, more bubonic plague. We didn't think we were for that, but that's what Bobby Kennedy wants.
Are voters going to make the connection between the White House policies, the CDC policies, the inflation and the tariff policies, where Trump keeps saying this is all going to be to the benefit of Americans? Are they going to connect their own individual economic circumstances to the White House policies?
You know, one of the weirdnesses about politics is presidents are held to account for things that aren't really their fault. Um, it wasn't, if prices go up, the president gets punished, whether or not the president had anything to do with it. Now, in this case, the president had a lot to do with it. But if the typical person's grocery basket costs $30 to $40 a week more than it did, look at the price of coffee, look at the price of hamburger. If you're spending $30 or $40 more a week to feed your family, the president suffers for that. Whether it's just or whether it's unjust. And in this case, it's super just. The president deliberately made the price of coffee go up, deliberately made the price of hamburger go up, deliberately made the price of Christmas decorations go up, deliberately made the price of Halloween costumes go up. He did all of that on purpose. He was warned that his policies would do it. He wanted to do it. He wants to move the burden of taxation from those best able to pay to those least able to pay. That's the whole point of a tariff, is you soak the people least able to pay. $30 billion a month in August, more in September.
Were you surprised by the extent of the reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination, both from the White House, from the public on both sides of the political divide?
Um, I don't know that my personal reaction is so revealing, because I'm really not deeply into a lot of these aspects of American culture. So I don't know exactly how many people were listening to Charlie Kirk. I was aware of him. I found him among the Trump communicators, one of the less bad. And it should be said in his favor that Charlie Kirk, to his credit, uh, did not truckle with anti-Semitism in the way that some of the other Trump communicators do. So I give him some credit for that. He was someone I was aware of as somebody who was important to a lot of people. And obviously the shooting was just as upsetting as, I mean, it's an attack on a political assassination is an attack not just on the victim and his family and his friends, but on everybody, because it attacks our possibilities of managing our disagreements in peaceful ways. This is a spectacular act of political murder. It's a terrible thing. And I think everyone who knows the human suffering from loss will want to have will have thoughts about it. Whatever you think about the contribution or non-contribution that person made to American life before he was brutally murdered.
There are so many things to pluck out of this, including for the second time that the Trump administration and the military has fired on Venezuelans in a boat, saying this was drug trafficking. The news emerged that supposedly the first boat was turning around when it was fired on.
Yeah.
And yet that story's kind of disappeared from the news cycle. Is this a harbinger that if we can do it twice, we can do it 3, 5, 10, 12 times?
Yeah. Well, it seems to me if you have identified drug dealers on the high seas, you would want to seize them, bring them in for questioning. Um, these people have presumably some useful information. So killing them seems a kind of counterproductive action. Also, if you did seize them and bring them into an American court, you wouldn't be allowed to kill them there. So why are you allowed to kill people on the high seas? Drug trafficking, heinous, if that's what they did. wicked an activity as it is, it's not a capital offense. It also is a warning of something that I've written a lot about with regard to the Trump administration, which is the Trump people have made quite clear that they would like to use deadly force inside the borders of Mexico. And I have been writing about this a lot since even before Trump came to power, that one of the big risks of the Trump presidency is the use of American military power inside Mexico without the consent of the Mexican government.
But the Mexican government has been pretty assertive in saying that isn't going to happen.
No, they have not. No,
No,
they have not been.
I thought President was very clear about that herself.
No, quite the opposite. Quite the
Oh.
opposite. So Claudia Sheinbaum has she plays a lot to American liberal opinion. That what she does is she has a kind of a sassy social media presence, but in fact she has been completely appeasing President Trump. And so in the early weeks of the Trump administration, the Trump administration began flying drones over Mexico, predator drones, the kind that can carry a missile. They seem not to be, but they have the potential to do it. They began flying those drones over Mexican territory without Mexican consent. When it was exposed by CNN's reporting, Claudia Sheinbaum then hastily, after the fact, gave them the consent. So her strategy with Trump, quite unlike the Canadian strategy, has been one of abject appeasement, while combining it with the sassy social media presence that makes her American fans, who shouldn't be her fans, think she's standing up for Mexico in a way that she's really not. She has a much less free press in Mexico than used to be the case. And so the Mexican press doesn't embarrass her. But no, she has not been a voice for Mexican sovereignty.
The presentations on Capitol Hill, I'm jumping around because there's so much going on Capitol Hill this morning by the two women who resigned from the CDC, including a woman who was head of it for only a month, talked about RFK Jr., who was contemptuous of the CDC, insulting the people who work there, and essentially demanding that science knuckle under to what it was he wanted it to be. And we have just heard, too, that COVID has fallen out of the top 10 of causes of death in the United States, which is something I expect he would be able to point to and say, see, COVID isn't the problem it used to be. But assess from your point of view the damage that you alluded to earlier in our conversation that can be done. And people have said that what's going on with the CDC, the ending of research grants with the America as a biomedical leader, that this may be the most devastating or near the top of the most devastating impacts of this administration.
Well, I will put in here now a commercial for the podcast that I host, because we talked about this at great length today with one of the great experts on the history of infectious disease, Kyle Harper, who's a professor at the University of Oklahoma and has written a book I strongly recommend called Plagues Upon the Earth. And a point that Kyle Harper made is that medical research has very long pipelines. The reason the United States was able to so quickly, or not just the United States and the developed world were able so quickly to develop anti-COVID vaccines in 2021. The prototypes are available in January of 2021, and you probably got it in April or May of 2021 for a disease that was first identified at the end of 2020 in China and first arrived in the United States the end of 2019 and first arrived in the United States early in 2020. The reason that could happen so fast was because there was more than a decade, almost 20 years, of previous research into the kind of vaccine that would be used against COVID. So Trump's Operation Warp Speed basically took a go-kart that had started a mile away, was in its last few yards toward the finish line, and jumped behind the go-kart and gave it a push to get it over the finish line, which is a good thing. But it didn't start from zero. So if you're interrupting the discovery of disease cures in 2025, that's going to affect the diseases that come along in 2035 and 2040. Bobby Kennedy Jr. does not believe in the germ theory of disease. He does not believe that diseases are caused by germs. Now, that's a level of malign ignorance that you would associate with some crackpot dictator of some Woody Allen country. But for the head of the Health and Human Services Administration of the United States to be saying, I don't believe in germs. I think Louis Pasteur was wrong. The past 200 years of medical technology are all wrong. We need to go back to amulets and ointments and incantations and chants. It's frightening, and it will have cost in human lives. And we're seeing that with the resurgence of measles, and we have to worry about a resurgence of polio.
What has always astonished me is the the granular detail that the Trump administration is willing to go to thwart everything that it opposes. And one recent example is that a very familiar image during the Civil War was that of an enslaved man named
Yeah,
Peter Gordon, whose back had been so whipped that it was nothing but welts and scars. And there's a scene in Spielberg's movie Lincoln, I think, where Lincoln's young son is looking at a cabinet photo of this.
yeah,
This photo will now be removed
yeah,
from, as I was reading from the Smithsonian, from historical accounts of the
yeah.
United States, because the account of slavery is presumably offensive to the narrative that Trump wants. This is not only granular, as I said, it's also
Yeah,
exhausting at
yeah.
every detail to try for Americans to counter this narrative and say, here's the truth, and we want it to be out there.
Well, an administration is made up of lots of people doing lots of things, and some of them are more central, and some of them are less. Um, with Bobby Kennedy, for example, Donald Trump has clearly decided that medical crackpots are part of his coalition. But it's obviously not that. Donald Trump himself can't care, doesn't care much one way or the other, and he's probably not deep down a medical crackpot. Um, but he's surrendered this issue, which maybe is not even a great political issue, but it's strongly important to a fragment of his coalition. Um, I think the what is going on with the teaching of American history is rather more central. I mean, the key to what Trump is doing is a narrative of victimhood of certain kinds of people and being confronted with the reality that contradicts those claims of victimhood. That's objectionable. And uh, I think Donald Trump's own personal priorities are much more about self-enrichment, much more about the tariffs, which he genuinely believes in, much more about appeasing his friend Vladimir Putin and giving over to Putin those parts of Europe that Putin wants. But there are important parts of the Trump coalition, and it's a big government with a lot of people working that care about having the Smithsonian tell a version of American history they find less distressing. And so they're ordering the Smithsonian to tell a version of history they find less distressing.
Knowing that Trump isn't going to object to that.
No, well, administrations, look, a normal administration works. Lots of times there are things that people do that the president either doesn't care about or sort of smacks his head and says, I wish I wouldn't do that, but it's important to some of my voters, so we'll do it. Um, as I say, I think the removing slave images is more central to the Trump project than the making measles great again. But there are important parts of the Trump constituency that want to do those different things.
Before I get to some of the wonderful questions that are coming in, there are a couple of points. One of them you just mentioned is about the relationship with Putin and the mixed signals that we see back and forth in the last few weeks in this administration um, about Ukraine. And, oh, well, we'll give Putin another couple of weeks to come around, which seems
Are,
to
are
be
the signals mixed? I find them unmixed.
there are there's support going to Ukraine, and then there are conditions on support going to Ukraine,
No,
and then
what,
there's
what,
no support going to Ukraine.
what Trump does is Trump has a problem, which is that there's probably a 70-30 or 80-20 majority in the Senate for helping Ukraine. And probably most Republican senators want to help, a large majority of Republican senators, and probably even most Republican members of the House want to help Ukraine. So that's a problem for him because he doesn't want to. So the way he copes with it is by periodically saying, any day now, any minute now, I'm going to do the thing you want me to do. So it's not, I'm not saying no, I'm saying not yet. But after this many months of saying not yet, that not yet looks a lot like a no. And I just want to put this in that the budget that Congress is considering has in the next fiscal year $800 million of assistance for Ukraine. How much is $800 million? It's less than Trump proposes to spend to retrofit the airplane that he's received from Qatar as a gift. Um, Ukraine is zeroed out. I don't think the signals. There's some There's some noises where Trump sort of misdirects people as to what his intentions are. But I think you need to read his. He is hostile to Ukraine for whatever reason. We can guess. We don't have to. We can observe the result. Hostile to Ukraine, friendly to Russia, wants Putin to have what Putin wants.
But he has to straddle for public purposes, even within his own party, moderate his expressions about that.
But most Republican senators and many Republican House members are not as anti-Ukraine and pro-Putin as he is, and that presents a political problem.
But how far are they willing to go to show their support and stand up to Trump in doing so?
Not as far as they should.
What about Trump and Gaza? We have just
Yeah,
seen, like the comment, well, we need more aid, we need more food, you need to let more in, but
yeah,
virtually nothing about what's been going on recently. Is he distracted? Is he indifferent? Is he
yeah.
just keeping a silence for political purposes?
Um, Trump has been a friend to Israel at a time when Israel needed a friend, and so I do give him some marks for that. I don't know that he's always giving the Israelis what the advice that is in their best long-term interest, and he's got other agendas. When Israel struck Qatar, it's pretty clear that it looks like the Trump people tipped off Qatar because you get you give the president a plane, you get something back. Um, so, and the Gaza problem, I think, is one where Trump's just not equipped to process that Israel needs stability on its Gaza frontier. Israel needs some kind of life for the people who live in Gaza. Israel needs a solution in Gaza that is acceptable to its new friends in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It can't leave Gaza a pile of rubble, and it can't drive the people of Gaza into exile. That's not consistent with Israelis' values. It's not consistent with Israeli security, and it's not consistent with the very important regional policy that Israel has of building this new network of friendship with the Gulf Arab states other than Qatar.
Before I get to the questions, I do have a question for you about ICE and the raid of the Hyundai facility in Georgia, which has backfired
Yeah,
tremendously because of the diplomatic blowback from Korea, our ally, South Korea, about this factory being built, which had great support in Georgia
yeah.
from Republican and Democratic politicians and policymakers, and it seemed to have blown up in their faces. So what now?
Um, this is a very central policy, unlike being pro measles. The immigration crackdown is central to the Trump agenda, central to his voters. And it's done in the most brutal possible way, in a way that I think is not going to be effective over the long term. But uh, ICE has been empowered on a scale that's a little mind boggling. The funding of ICE is going to make ICE a larger law enforcement agency than the FBI, DEA, all of them put together. It's going to have a budget almost as big as the United States Marine Corps. And it's staffing up very, very fast. And as many people who know a lot more about policing than I do point out, you can't build a police agency that fast because you intake people who shouldn't be there. Good police departments are built with careful screening. They're built by making sure that the people in the department understand all the rights of the accused person. A person doesn't cease to have rights because they've been detained, even if they are completely guilty of the thing they've been detained for. And good police forces understand that, recruit gradually, build up slowly, build up from within organically. This crash program with this enormous budget is going to, with reduced standards. ICE has the biggest budget, the lowest hiring standards, and the fastest drive to completion of any law enforcement agency I think ever, certainly since the Second World War. Um, and what you get are these kinds of fiascos, as we've seen in Georgia, where you arrest 300 South Korean executives and engineers many of whom look to have been there completely legally. In other cases, the infractions were very trivial, and no one deserved to be shackled and treated like a criminal or a dangerous person. That, some people may have needed to be served with a piece of paper that said, you have a certain number of hours to book yourself a business class flight back to South Korea, enjoy the warm nuts.
But in the long term, this essentially what some people have said is a potential for a standing army existing within the United States and with perhaps um, something down the road beyond immigration enforcement.
Look, we have National Guard troops here in Washington, D.C., where I speak to you, patrolling the center city. I mean, they're pretty benign. I mean, I've had encounters with them. They're cheerful and polite, and they're not repressing the citizenry. But the effect of them has been we have seen a collapse in the business of bars and restaurants in downtown. Now, the people who go to downtown Washington bars and restaurants, which are pretty expensive, are probably not people with doubtful immigration status, but they just don't want to be there. Now imagine deploying that kind of force in blue cities in red states in an election year. You will keep people off the streets and maybe deter them from voting. And that, I think, is the thing they're experimenting with.
Hmm. We saw that probably 30, 40 years ago in Orange County here, where there were uniformed people who were not actually police standing at polling
Yeah.
stations and their presence deterring Latinos who were entitled to vote from showing up to vote.
Look, in general, am a believer in stricter immigration enforcement than was the case under Joe Biden. But one of the consequences of having this long period of weak enforcement is you don't have a simple binary status of legal, not legal. It's a spectrum. There are people with many different statuses. There are, for example, people who are legal to vote whose spouses are not. There are people who are legal to vote whose parents are not. There are people who are legal not to vote, but are legal, but they're between they're one visa, their green card has lapsed, and the next one is to be renewed, but they haven't picked it up yet, and they're in intermediate state. So if you can terrify enough of those people, you can keep the legal voter away from the voting booth because that voter is worried about, well, I was if anything happens to me, who takes care of my parents? And they're not legal. So you can cast a pall that deters legal voters from voting, that deters legal residents from being on streets they have a right to walk on, and that generally terrorizes people whom the government wants terrorized.
Let's get to some of the excellent questions people are putting up here for you, and you can put your question in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get it to put to David Frum. Several people have asked, given the onslaught of so many threats to democracy coming at us every day, do you think the Democrats are able to crystallize an effective message? They're in a tough spot because, let's see, this just moved around here. Let me see. Anyway, the question from several people is about they're expressing outrage, but not seen as fighting back enough. And what can they do effectively?
Yeah. I am a big believer that parties that don't hold executive power don't need to worry too much about what they do, because I think the party of the executive loses elections rather than the party of the non-executive winning them. Um, I think in general, with a party that is not the executive, less is more. And you see these dumb debates on Twitter that say X is a distraction from Y. Y is a distraction from Z. Well, the thing you need to is the people who will defeat Trump, the many tens of millions of people who will defeat Trump, they care about lots of different things. And it's not for you to say, you care about issue A, I think you should care about issue B. If issue A, B, C, D, E are all there, let each person decide what the voting issue is for that person. Some people care more about the Epstein files. Some people care more about tariffs. Some people will care more about killing people on the high seas. Some people care more about the government suppressing speech. No one of those things subtracts from any of the others. And it's not a productive exercise to yell at something called the Democrats, which don't exist because they're a coalition, and say, this is what you Democrats ought to be doing. That the things that Democrats in different Democrats ought to be doing in different places. And by the way, I'm not a Democrat. The coalition needs to be broad enough to include a lot of people who aren't Democrats and don't like Democrats and never will be Democrats, but want to save the country from Donald Trump.
So is what Donald Trump is doing that may displease someone who's concerned about overreaching on immigration or about their economics and their grocery bill, is all that enough to generate a get out the vote movement for, say, the midterms?
It had better be. Now, the mechanics of doing a get out the vote, that's what political parties are for. It's like, we're not going to tell you why. It's not our job to tell you what the reason is that you want to vote. But if you want to vote, it's our job to make it easier for you. So to help you with the registration complexities, to explain to you what your legal rights are, to have, if you're older and don't have an automobile, or you need somebody to help you from your apartment to the door of the car, we will provide all of that. But you have to provide your own motive. And I think people sometimes get mad. They see something they don't like and say, why doesn't the candidate say this or that? I remember back when I was writing speeches for President W. Bush, this happened to me all the time. I mean, literally at least once a week, often more often than that. Somebody would approach me and they would have a piece of paper. They said, and if the president would only say this, this would turn everything around. And it was something that obviously had been reciting in the shower to themselves, imagining the cheering halls of Congress. And you look at this and you'd want to be polite and say, okay, you've written a speech that is exactly the right speech for you, to win you. And someone else has written the exact speech to win them, but you have to win all of them. And each of them has different reasons. So don't worry so much about what the Democrats ought to say. Worry about avoiding stupid mistakes. Worry about making sure that the infrastructure is there. And then understand that each voter will supply his or her own reason for the casting of that ballot.
David from Boston says, let's get to the heart of the matter. Is there any conceivable way that Trump can stay in office past the end of the second term? You know that he will try to get the Supreme Court's acquiescence, presidential fiat supported by the Congress and the military. That's David's question.
Yeah, I think he will try. Um, I mean, look, Donald Trump's words are not predictors of necessarily what will happen, but they're predictors of what he has in mind, and he has this in mind. Now, ironically, one of the big victims here is J.D. Vance and the Republican hopes in 2028. Now, just to put this in context. So, Ronald Reagan's second term, Ronald Reagan is elected in November of 1984 to his second term and final term as president, of course. George H.W. Bush writes in his diary that he had his first post-election lunch with Ronald Reagan in December. It was about 3 or 4 weeks after the election. They had lunch together one-on-one, and George H.W. Bush said, I hope I have your blessing. I intend to be a candidate for the presidency in 1988. And Bush then got Reagan's blessing, and between December of 84 and April of 85, assembled his entire team. And this is reported by the New York Times in April 1985. He had a meeting at Kennebunkport with all the extended Bush family and with Lee Atwater and the members of the campaign team, and he introduced the team to the candidate. Campaign fully formed by April of 85. Well, April of 2025 is in the rearview mirror. There's no J.D. Vance team because Donald Trump would cut him off at the knees. Now, Vance is doing many things to get ready for a 2028 run. And one of the reasons he's been so extreme on silencing free speech after Charlie Kirk is because he thinks that's where the Republican electorate is. But he doesn't have a campaign manager, he doesn't have an organization. And Trump's hopes for a third term come in part, obviously, at the expense of the U.S. Constitution, but also at the expense of J.D. Vance's hopes for a first term.
Stuart's question is, in 2017, you correctly predicted that conservatives would not reject democracy if they became convinced they could not win democratically.
Yeah.
Do you believe they are satisfied with those results, that they can live with what's going on?
I think there's a big question mark over their heads about 2026. If the election in 2026 is free and fair, the Republicans will certainly lose the House of Representatives and very likely the Senate too. Although they have a good map in the Senate, so they may have enough advantages. But these tariffs are so painful to so many people, so they need to head that off. And I think they're quite self-conscious, and that's the reveal after this appalling, heinous murder of Charlie Kirk, is that they are using this terrible crime against the Kirk family, against the country, to build a plan for suppressing free and fair political competition in the year ahead.
Ruth and others want to know, we talked earlier about the Supreme Court and the Kimmel case, but if the Kimmel case isn't one to go to the Supreme Court, what kind of First Amendment case do you think might get there? Who would be carrying that ball and what the results might be?
Yeah, I don't think there's a Kimmel case at the Supreme Court because I don't think ABC wants to contest this case. Kimmel will have a private right of action against ABC for breach of contract. He may have some kind of civil rights action against Brendan Carr. That there are actions if a federal official
He's
limits.
The FCC chairman.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
If a federal has interfered with your civil rights, you can sometimes bring a civil action against him, and Kimmel may have one of those. But the First Amendment claim it was ABC's right of Jimmy Kimmel. It feels like he lost it, but from a legal point of view, the person whose right to free speech was circumscribed was the ABC corporate entity, not Jimmy Kimmel. He doesn't have a right to be on ABC's air. Only ABC has a right to be on ABC's air. But there will be cases, and I think some of the people who have lost their jobs in the past days because of sanctions against their employers, because they didn't say the right thing after the death of Charlie Kirk, they may have various kinds of civil claims.
Well, that gets to the definition of what the word celebrating is. When Pam Bondi has talked about people celebrating Charlie Kirk's death, it seemed to extend to people who were simply posting Charlie Kirk's extreme comments online.
Yeah. Look, if you celebrate death, that's antisocial, that's heartless behavior. And if you point out that someone who's been brutally murdered in this way led a lot less exemplary life, it's kind of tactless behavior. And I mean, the person I've been comparing Charlie Kirk to in recent days is Malcolm X. So Malcolm X had many good qualities, many bad qualities, was cut down. Still a lot of mystery about exactly who did it and why. If you were around during Malcolm X's time, the 72 hours after his death were not the best moment to point out all the ways that Malcolm X was not an ideal person. There were going to be years and decades in which his legacy would be important, which there would be time to say Malcolm X, yes, you're right, those of you who loved him, about the good things he stood for. He also stood for these bad things. For 72 hours, you don't have to do it. You have a right to do it, but you don't have to do it. And it's not tactful. That said, if we can be fired from our jobs for not being tactful, well, there are going to be a lot more unemployed people.
So it's sort of the ABC phenomenon writ small.
Well, no, in ABC, they were threatened with direct state retaliation. That was not about someone saying, ABC, you really give it a rest. Can't it wait till next week? The chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates ABC, which has previously been subject to other kinds of sanctions by the Trump administration, said there will be consequences for you if this man stays on the air. That's not cancel culture. That is state repression.
We have a couple of questions, and I'll conflate them from Helene and from Bonnie about the upcoming elections. Helene, isn't it possible to have free and fair elections? And Bonnie, what about Trump's threat to prevent voters from casting their ballots by mail,
Yeah.
which Republican voters do as well?
Yeah. Well, um, one of the ironies of the situation is if you're old, as I guess I am now, and as Donald Trump certainly is, you remember a world in which Republicans were very assiduous voters and Democrats tended to be less attached to the political process. Republicans were homeowners, Democrats were renters. Republicans tended to be middle-aged, Democrats tended to be very young or very old. Republicans were white, Democrats were black. And so if you made it slightly difficult to vote, you helped Republicans and hurt Democrats. But what has been true in the Trump era is actually Democrats have been winning more and more votes from those most closely attached to the political process. And Republicans have been doing better with those less attached to the political process. And if you make it a little difficult to vote, I think you end up probably in many places hurting Republicans more than Democrats. I don't know that Trump has got that message because I think a lot of his thinking is kind of backward looking. But
Just
yeah,
today,
yeah, if you were to suppress voting by mail, who would you hurt? Rural people, military people, older people.
the administration has, as I gathered from today's news, sued Maine and Oregon for their voter registration rolls,
Yeah.
which contain information including partial Social Security numbers, as a prelude to trying to do the same in other blue
Yeah.
states. To what end?
Yeah. I think just generally you can see they're trying turning a lot of different door handles with a view. They know if every American who is legally entitled to vote were able to vote in 2026, they would do badly because they have made groceries more expensive for everybody, and they did it on purpose. So that's a problem. Making groceries more expensive on purpose is a problem. Aside from everything else they've done, there's that one fact: your groceries cost more, the coffee costs more, the hamburger costs more, Christmas decorations will cost more, Christmas trees will cost more, everything will cost more. And they did it. They knew what they were doing. They did it on purpose. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a miscalculation. It was a plan. And they did it in order to shift the burden of taxation from those best able to pay to those least able to pay. They did it on purpose, knowing what they were doing. That makes people mad. So they obviously have to interfere with the election mechanics, or they will pay the price for making people pay more for everything on purpose.
There's a question about what happened to the $1 trillion or so for infrastructure from the Biden administration. And I've actually read stories that some of those projects are going forward, that Trump is
Yeah.
just, as maybe his habit, putting his own name
Yeah.
on these projects.
Well, this is going to take me a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. I'm going to refer you to my great Atlantic colleague, Derek Thompson. But the Biden people crammed a lot of money into the pipeline without thinking about how do we reform the process of government so the money can be spent. I don't have to tell Californians about the fiasco of the California high-speed railway system. Biden, the best thing about Biden was that he was a man from a different time who remembered American politics when it was less bitter and polarized. And the worst thing about Biden was he was a man from a different time. He couldn't absorb how things were different in the 21st century from how they were different in the 20th. He remembered an America where if the government wrote a big check to build things, things would be built. And he couldn't wrap his mind around America where government would write the big check, but things would not be built because a lot of local committees would get in the way. And I think a lot of his infrastructure money has not been spent, or if it has been spent, has not been spent on infrastructure. It's been spent on litigation.
Jack in Santa Barbara said if the Republicans in the House and Senate vote to limit Trump's tariffs in March, as they're considering, Would this help their chances of holding on to Congress in 2026, or has that ship sailed?
Well, understand what it means to vote. There are things that they could vote to do, but most of those things would require a presidential signature.
Hmm.
So Congress is Trump. It really depends more on the courts than on Congress. The case, the Constitution awards Congress power over tariffs. Since 1934, Congress has delegated a lot of that power to the president, but mostly with a view to lowering tariffs, not to raising them. Now, there are two sort of main silos of presidential power to raise tariffs. One is the president has certain powers to raise tariffs permanently for national defense purposes, and he has other powers to raise tariffs temporarily for emergency purposes. And Trump has taken permanent but limited and large but temporary and weave them together to create a general right to impose tariffs for all times for any reason to raise revenue. Two courts, the United States Court of International Trade and the D.C. Circuit, have said you can't do that. That case now goes to the Supreme Court, and we'll find out whether they have any integrity or not, because the case is pretty clear.
I
But
think we have time.
the court may try to split the difference as it did on presidential immunity.
Before I get to your wrap up, I think we have time for one more question. It would be Sandra in Los Osos, California. Proposition 50 would allow or gerrymandering in California to counter the gerrymandering for
Yeah.
Republican districts in Texas and in other states. Is this a winning game in any state, in any configuration or outcome that you can foresee?
Um, Look, in the long run, it's a losing game. But I think one of the lessons Democrats tried this experiment. So Trump horribly abused all kinds of government institutions in his first term, and Democrats said when they won in 2020, okay, let's get back to normal. Let's have Merrick Garland make the Department of Justice once again apolitical. Let's try it that way. And I don't think anyone can look back at that experiment and say that was a great success. So we can't be in a situation where Donald Trump gets to have stooge FBI directors and Democratic presidents have to have honest FBI directors. Donald Trump gets to use the Department of Justice as a tool of power, and Democrats have to not do that. Um, Either everyone plays by good and decent rules, or we're into a realm of tit for tat. And I think on the gerrymandering question, uh, I, I I really regret to say tit for tat is the way ahead. I don't know what other choice anybody has if they don't want to be taken advantage of.
Hmm. So now all the rule book is out, the old democratic institutions. It's just the scramble of nature, bloody in tooth and claw in the political arena. That's very dispiriting.
Um, you're We could have escaped one Trump term with minor damage to the institutions and norms of the United States. Two Trump terms are going to leave behind a lot of damage. They're going to leave, and that's tragic. This shouldn't have happened. Hillary Clinton should have campaigned in Wisconsin, and we would have been spared all of this misery. Um, but it did happen, and I don't think it's going to work. The Democrats say, "Okay, you can gerrymander as much as you want. We're going to play by the Marquis of Queensberry rules." That's just being a victim.
We have a minute left that we always devote to trying to pull some optimism and something hopeful and even action advice out of the present moment. So let's check with you and see what
Yeah.
you can give us on that score.
Well, here we are doing the thing that needs to be done. Everyone who's on this call is doing the right thing. And we have to keep doing it. You have to believe. The most important thing is to believe in the efficacy of your action, not to listen to people say, oh, well, nothing will make, they'll get away with it. It'll work. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. If you believe they'll get away with it, then for sure they get away with it. It's very important to retain the capacity to be shocked. It's very important to retain generous anger. It's very important to retain your sense of humanity. Um, and I think that this terrible crime against Charlie Kirk is a perfect example of this. You can condemn the crime, grieve with the afflicted, and still fight the terrible abuse of this crime that is being attempted by the Trump administration to shut down the free society of the United States.
Is it hard to make that nuanced argument in this day and age?
I just did it. It didn't take me even 10 seconds.
So people want to be hopeful.
Look, being hopeful is, you have to be committed. You don't need to have an opinion about the future. You only need to have an opinion about your own actions. What will I do? What will I ask my friends to do? What will I believe? And what will I refuse to be afraid of? Those are your choices. The future will take care of itself. The future is what we together collectively make of it.
David Frum, thank you. I hope you will come back because
Thank
there
you.
will always be something to talk about. He's a political commentator, former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, a senior editor at Atlantic, and you can follow his podcast. We hope to put some information out there for you on
Thank
that
you.
as well. Thank
Bye-bye.
you again. Thank you all for watching. We hope you will be back on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time when the new chancellor of UCLA, Julio Frank, is here talking about can America's universities survive the current assault. There's momentum gathering on both sides of that, and you'll want to listen to that and hear what it is that our American educational institutions are facing and what their counter arguments are. Thank you so much for joining us and for supporting us. Go to the website. You can find out more information on how to do so and on our upcoming programs. Good night.
Bye-bye.